What happens to factor prices such as wages and real interest on capital when factors of production can move across countries? I'm going to explain this by using the example that I have used in previous videos on factor endowments and factor prices. In that example, there were two countries, the US with a certain endowment of labor and capital, and Mexico with its own endowment of a certain amount of labor and capital. Also in that example, as I had explained, the US is a capital abundant country and Mexico is a labor abundant country. And because the US is a labor abundant country, the wages in US would be higher than wages in Mexico. And the return on capital in the US would be lower than the return to capital in Mexico. Now, I'm going to draw the labor market in the US and the labor market in Mexico. I have drawn the demand and supply of labor in the US so that the equilibrium wage is higher than the equilibrium wage in Mexico, which is what we would expect based on our theory. Now, what would happen if labor were free to move from one country to another? In which direction would labor mainly flow? Well, since wages are higher in US compared to Mexico, we most likely expect to find that labor will move from Mexico to the US. What will be the result of this migration on the wages of workers in US and Mexico? So we can understand that with the help of the demand and supply diagram. As labor moves out of Mexico, the supply of labor is going to shift in Mexico, which is going to increase the wages of workers in Mexico. On the other hand, as the US receives new immigrants, the supply of labor is going to increase in the US, which will decrease the wages of US workers. So US wages will go down and Mexican wages will go up. As a result, the gap between US and Mexican wages will begin to close, and this process will continue until the wages equalize across the two countries. Now, will the migration in any way affect the return to capital in the two countries? Recall that the return to capital was higher in Mexico because in Mexico, capital was relatively scarce in relation to labor compared to in the United States. In the United States, capital was relatively abundant in relation to labor, and market rewards scarcity. Now, how does that change when the migration takes place? When workers go from Mexico to the US, now in the US, capital is no longer all that abundant in relation to labor. It has kind of become more scarce in relation to labor. As a result, the return to capital in the US begins to rise. On the other hand, because the labor force of Mexico has shrunk, capital in Mexico has now become abundant in relation to the new workforce. As a result, the return to capital in Mexico will fall.